So now that you've gotten your comparables, and these comparables could be solds, actives, pendings, expireds, whatever, but is there a difference? I mean, obviously, I live on a farm out in the middle of Douglas County, and it's an interesting dichotomy because there are Amish homes to the south, and little tracts sometimes sell very high because they're starved for
demand.
Yeah, it's demand. Yeah, that's right, supply and demand. But a typical. I know that I've had appraisals done on my house, and the appraiser was pulling his hair out trying to get comps, and how do you handle those situations?
Yeah, so again, what the appraiser...
Or these outliers, I guess.
Yeah, so what the appraiser always hopes for is, I want the appraisal in that tract neighborhood, right? I want the 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch, and maybe that's...
there's been 10 sales in the last 6 months.
Year. Maybe that's the type of appraiser I want to be, is I only want to do 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch and tract neighborhoods. I'm your guy for that. But no, in rural areas, rural appraisers, they have challenges because oftentimes, like Norm, around your house, there maybe hasn't been a similar home sell in 5 years or 25 years, or there may not be a similar home, period. So in that case, we have to look for what we call the best comparable sales. So,
and I will tell you, the appraiser in my situation actually had to take a similar property that was located in a different county about 20 or 25 miles away. So that was one of the comparables they used.
Yeah, and typically on rural properties, that distance does extend out to about 25 miles, or maybe even a wider range. But typically for secondary market, once they start to get more than 25 miles, that starts to throw some major red flags.
Okay, so that kind of touches on that, because I know that it doesn't maybe happen in the Chicago area much, but there still are some outliers in those areas too. So then, once you have these comparables, how and why do you make adjustments with those? And you always adjust off the comparable, just like we do in CMAs.
Yeah, so that's where, typical to the CMA, the adjustment process comes in. And what we're adjusting for is any difference between the subject property and the comparable sales. Now, there's several different methodologies for determining what an adjustment should be. The common ones in the appraisal world are what we call paired sales analysis, right? Which some appraisers use, where basically that is taking a large list of sales that have minor differences. Maybe one has 3 bedrooms and one has 4 bedrooms, but other than that, they're pretty much the same home. Well, if you get enough of those, you can figure out what the difference in value between a 3-bedroom and a 4-bedroom home with those characteristics is.
And it could be determined by market area, too.
Yeah, it could be determined by market area.
I always like to use the analogy, a 3-car garage in a neighborhood in the northwest side of Chicago is probably not as valuable as somebody that has a 3-car garage in the suburbs.
Correct. Yeah.
Or out in my neighborhood.
Yep. Or your property might sit on 10 acres, but the property that you're appraising might sit on 5 acres or 15 acres. So we have to figure out an adjustment for that.
Okay.
So paired sales, one, okay. The other one, very complicated, but multiple regression, right?
Now, what is that?
Yeah, so multiple regression is a statistical analysis, okay? Not done on pencil and paper, okay, but where, again, you can load data into a statistical package, and it will, assuming you enter it right, provide some validity of differences between properties. Then we've got the one that is maybe in some ways the most valid if you can get good data out of it, and why I encourage the good relationship with realtors is this idea about market survey. So talking with peers in the industry, right? So that could be other appraisers or industry professionals, realtors in this case, to get their opinions, again, backed by data, okay, that says, well, if I've got a 2-bath home versus a 1.5-bath home that is pretty much the same otherwise, how much more, or could be less, typically not in this case, is that 2-bath home worth versus the 1.5 bath home. But those are the ways that we come up with those adjustments.
You know, and I've seen this where, you know, in teaching class, they'll say, well, don't you have a schedule
Right.
that says, a 3-bed over a 2-bed is worth $5,000?
Right.
And that drives me crazy because it really depends on market and market area.
Yeah.
And you guys don't use any kind of thing like that, do you? I mean, there's
Typically-
nothing in USPAP or the ANSI standards that just does,
That says that additional bathroom is
or
worth
that additional
$5,000.
garage or whatever. Yeah, I hope not, because that's
No,
to
it
me
is. It's all determined on market value, and I think that you know, as an agent or as a realtor, you recognize that if you're in a $500,000 home, you know, that additional square footage or that additional garage bay is worth a far different price than if you're selling $50,000 homes.
normally the bigger the square footage, the nicer they are.
Right.
Yeah, and that's that theory. So, you know, then we get into this question: is why is my neighbor's house either higher, lower, you know, and all of this? How come they sold it for $280,000 and you're appraising mine at $260,000? It's the
Right.
same house.
Yeah,
it's right across the street.
So the two
That's what
issues.
you always get,
It
you know?
is. Unfortunately, those are calls, or fortunately, that we get often. Right. You know, and it's not often my neighbor's house appraised for X amount. It's my neighbor's house sold for X amount. You know, but a few thoughts on that. First of all, maybe if it was an appraisal, you have to remember that appraisal is just an opinion of value.
Yeah, right.
And so maybe.
And you know, quite honestly, a sale
Yeah,
is an
it's
opinion of value.
Absolutely.
The buyer had an opinion it was worth that.
Yep.
And the seller thought it was too, and they sold. And so actually, they're both opinions.
Yeah. But
may or may not be correct, but that's what they are.
But oftentimes we do see that there's a difference in fact. You know, the subject property, they may say it's the same home, but in reality, it might not be the same home. Their lot size could be different. They could have improved the property. You know, maybe they've done a new roof or kitchens or bathrooms, or you know, things like that. So oftentimes there are differences that account for that difference in sale price. The other issue that usually comes up, and this is true with me, an appraiser as well, is that sellers, right, or the owner of a home usually has some emotional investment in that home that
And the buyers can sometimes too.
That makes it very difficult to see past issues in the home, or you know, most sellers.
Well, they can fix that up.
Yeah,
That's
they
no
can
big
fix
deal.
that up. Or most sellers, if you were to ask them, and as an appraiser, we don't ask the question, but how do you think your home compares to your neighbor's home?
Yeah.
Well, most of the time they're going to tell you, well, mine's way nicer.
There you go.
Mine's worth.
You know, we've already touched on this, but a little bit. But just to clarify, very seldom are you going to use income approach on residential. I mean, unless it is actually a rental property.
Right.
And then cost approach would probably normally be used maybe on new construction, or there's something so unique about it that there's not really a good way to do it other than cost.
Right, Norm. So one of the questions that or concerns that we get oftentimes when a homeowner, right, or a buyer in this case, receives an appraisal back, right, is they'll go, well, the appraiser didn't even complete the cost approach or the income approach section. That has to be a deficient appraisal. But like we talked before, oftentimes it's not relevant. So in the case of the cost approach, their methodologies for cost approaches typically use industry standard cost handbooks, like Marshall and Swift is probably the biggest one. But they estimate the life expectancy of a structure typically at 60 years. Okay, so that's saying that they fully depreciate the cost of a structure out over 60 years. Well, if you're appraising a home that is 60 years old, the cost approach, in theory, could come back at almost zero because it's fully depreciated. Income, also, you'll see that on most form appraisals, the income approach is very limited. So it takes a GRM, a gross rent multiplier, right, that has been statistically determined by the appraiser, and multiplies that by the gross monthly rent, and lo and behold, that's the value of the property.
Right.
But again, unless we are in
Or you could use a cap approach or something.
Yep, you could use cap rate. Yep. But again, unless this is in an area where there are lots of rental properties that are rented and sold frequently, the income approach is not going to produce a valid value or opinion of market value for that property.
Okay. The other thing, and we touch on this a little bit, but and I want to expound on it a little bit, but so who gets the appraisal report? Of course, it's going to go back to the lender, and probably, of course, the buyer's going to get a copy. But let's just say that it didn't appraise. It was low appraisal. And the lender says, well, we can't do this. And so at that point, would even the seller or the seller's agent get a copy of that?
Typically not, sometimes. So what we always have to remember is the appraiser has a confidentiality requirement to the client. And that client, most of the time, is going to be the lender, right? And so it's not saying that they won't, but if the seller or the seller's agent, or even the buyer's agent for this matter, wants a copy of that report, it shouldn't be provided by the appraiser unless the lender or the client has released that to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I know I've gotten phone calls about this as an executive officer that it low appraised, and now they won't give me a copy of the report so we can find out how bad a report it was.
Where that appraiser messed up.
And so, but there's really not much you can do. Now, a lot of times though, I have seen lenders will request another appraisal. And of course, there's a cost associated with that. And that's when the buyer is firmly wanting to buy the property and or figure out a different way to accomplish the sale.
So typically, yes, when there is a disagreement between appraised value
that's
and
never
purchase
happened
price.
to you.
Oh, never. Unfortunately, it's not. I mean, that's not uncommon, right? But typically, the lender has a couple options, and you have to realize that the lender is the one in the driver's seat on that because they're the client. So, first of all, the lender can go back and request, maybe it's a reconsideration of value, or again, if there are errors or deficiencies in the report, right, that those corrections be made. But in the event where something else is going to be ordered, the first step is usually an appraisal review. And again, that's done by a different appraiser, but that appraiser is evaluating the quality
of the appraisal
report. Now, they may end up agreeing with the original appraisal, or in the instance when they don't agree with the original appraisal, they are then developing an appraisal report, based on the facts presented in the original appraisal report. So most of the time, the reviewer appraiser does not visit the subject property. They're not going to do their own inspection.
They're just looking at the document and saying, does this make sense?
Or sometimes, as you indicated, sometimes the lender will order a separate appraisal, and we'll start that process over again.
It kind of puts the listing agent in this case, or even the buyer's agent, in a difficult position if they don't see the appraisal.
Right.
And so but once again, like you said, the lender's they're in the driver's seat.
And the appraiser, I would point out to that, know that it's not the appraiser just being difficult. If a realtor calls the appraiser and says, hey, I know you turned in that appraisal and it's short, can we talk about it? And that appraiser says, no, we can't. Realize that it may not be them just being argumentative and difficult. There is a confidentiality rule that they are bound by, to where they're really not supposed to discuss the details of that appraisal with you.
Right. Okay. We touched on what you do at an appraisal, and while you're actually at the assignment, and then we briefly talked, and we didn't really get into in depth, but what is different with like a conventional loan appraisal, FHA, VA, or any of these other federally guaranteed programs? What do you have to do differently in those?
Yeah, so in the case of USDA, United States Department of
Rural
Agriculture, which we
development is
call
what
rural
we-
development, right? FHA, and VA, Veterans Affairs loans. All three of those loan types typically require an appraisal that complies with HUD handbook requirements, right?
Okay.
And so this adds a whole lot of more requirements to the appraisal process. Now, it's still not a home inspection, which we're going to talk about, okay? But it requires the appraiser to verify, okay, that this appraisal or this property complies with HUD handbook. So some of the things, many of them focus on
Give me some examples.
Yeah.
Of,
So a lot of it has to do with what we call health and safety requirements, right?
Okay.
So that is kitchens and bathrooms or any electrical outlet that is within 6 feet of a water source,
GFI,
right?
GFI,
Has to have
yeah.
GFIs. Now, either GFI outlets or they could have GFI breakers in the breaker panel. Some other, I'm going to call them specifications, right? Your water heater, it has to have a TPR relief valve that extends to within 6 inches of the floor, right? In order to meet HUD handbook requirements, right? Now, some of this goes along with what's commonly accepted in your market area too. So like in our market area, if you've got a house that has a glass fuse panel, that's not common in our market area anymore. So that won't meet HUD handbook requirements.
Not even with a penny behind it?
Not even with a penny or a paper clip behind it. No, not at all. So we see that. Other health and safety issues can be like if you've got steps that are going down to a basement or to an upstairs, needs to have a handrail associated with that. Your
Knob and tube.
knob and tube wiring, not allowed, right?
Even though it's still,
Yep.
it's still recognized.
Yeah, it still works. It's still providing
works.
electricity.
But a lot of times you find that those are covered with insulation, and that's where
Yeah.
there's a problem.
Here's
Or
an
a fire
interesting
hazard.
one. So on those appraisal types, the appraiser is required to inspect both the attic and the crawl space. Now it's a limited inspection. What I mean by that is the minimum standards is a head and shoulders inspection. So at a minimum, the appraiser must stick their head and shoulders inside the basement, crawl space, or attic, right, to inspect that area. But that's just...
And you love doing that in
we
July,
love,
don't
yeah,
you?
we love doing that in July. Those attics are usually perfectly cool in this July weather. So yeah.
So, but it's not, so the difference is what I would call more of a visual, just general compliance, whereas a home inspector, they have a whole different set of standards. And so that is basically the difference.
Definitely. Now, the appraiser is still, as part of that report, right, or as part of that process, they're required to test what we call major mechanical items. So, is the hot water heater working? Well, the way the appraiser tells if the hot water heater is working is they turn on the hot
faucet.
water, and if the water gets warm, then the hot water is working.
Well, the home inspector may have a temperature or a thermometer on it and those kind of things.
Absolutely. Does the furnace and central air work? Well, it's July.
And it's 72 degrees
Yep.
in here, so it's working.
It's working, right? So things like that. But there are a lot of differences between an appraisal and a home inspection.
And I think we recognize those differences. But I think what I have noticed in feedback from real estate licensees is that, well, now the appraiser's out here doing inspections. Well, the reason they are is because they're
required
required under their assignment, if it's a HUD or a FHA, VA, or rural development loan.
Right. We encourage or explain to clients that the intent of the appraisal, right, is to establish the market value of the home.
Right.
Which is far different. The intent of the home inspection is it's supposed to identify problems with the home, right? The appraiser may look for, like we were talking about, obvious flaws. That roof has very little asphalt left on it. The shingles are curling, right? It doesn't produce hot water.
Now you don't, like on a breaker panel. You don't take the panel
We
off.
do not
and
take
look
the panel
like
off.
double taps and all
No,
of that.
we do not look
That's
at
what
any
it's-
of
yeah.
that.
Okay.
So those are different. The home inspection goes much, much deeper
Right.
than what an appraiser or an appraisal will look at in terms of health and safety issues and the condition of the home.
Okay, so then when you've done all your data gathering and all of that, now you have to write a report. So what's that process and who's involved, or what kind of standards do you have on that?
So typically that report writing process, so we've done the site inspection, we've taken our measurements, gathered that information. We're also, as we briefly mentioned before, going to look at a lot of public record sources. Now that may be property record cards, assessment data, lots of information from the recorder in terms of previous sales on the property. Are there any known encumbrances against it? Now a lot of that comes out in the title search.
Sure.
That's not the appraiser's responsibility.
But once again, it's kind of one of those things where you're going to make that in part of your report.
But we verify, like for
Yeah.
instance, on an appraiser, as part of a purchase, they are required also to analyze the purchase contract. Well, one of the first easy things that I always look for is it says in the purchase contract, it says we're purchasing this property. And oftentimes that includes a PIN number and a legal description. Well, one of the first things I'm going to verify from public
that
record
correct?
is that the correct PIN
Right.
and legal description, because I'll tell you, there are instances all the time where it is not.
Right.
So we're evaluating things from public record sources. We're evaluating that sales contract. Are there any uncommon inclusions in that sales contract? Whether that's personal property, or are they given some wild amount in sales concessions or things like that. But then we're preparing this report. We're taking the information that we've gathered, we're putting that into the report, we're selecting comparable sales, we're analyzing the market, we're putting comments about the market in the report, making adjustments, and ultimately we're coming up with an opinion of value for that property.
Well, and what we see a lot of times, of course, is there's going to be maybe personal property or other concessions involved with that whole process within the contract. And of course, that's part of what you're looking for, those kind of outliers.
Because it impacts the opinion of value.
Yeah. I've heard these terms thrown around like UAD, UCDP. What is all that?
So that's one of the things, and that's really important to know, because again, we talked before, who's going to see this report? Well, oftentimes if we're doing it for purchase, that report is prepared for the lender. But that's really important that the buyer, because they're required to by law, is going to receive a copy of that report at closing, if not before. And if they're looking through that report, there's going to be a lot of terminology in there and abbreviations and codes that they may not recognize. And that's where UAD and UCDP comes in. So UAD is the Uniform Appraisal Data Set. Okay? And UCDP, that goes right along with it, is the Uniform Collateral Data Portal.
Is that kind of like what we use in MLS lingo, RISO standards?
Oh, yeah,
I mean, it's that kind
absolutely.
of same thing where there's a standard set
So
for how you develop your report?
Yes.
And the data you use?
Yeah, so UAD is a component of the Uniform Mortgage Data Program. That was an initiative of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that got put in place in 2011, I believe.
Oh, after the crash.
Yeah. But it's a comprehensive set of standards that are meant to standardize mortgage loan data.
Okay.
And that's all about terminology. So in our appraisal reports today, you'll see like quality and condition. There are what we call Q and C ratings, and they're 1 to 6. So you will see that an appraiser will rate your property like a Q3 or Q4. Well, now as a borrower, I don't know what a Q3 or a Q4 is.
I mean, it's like average quality.
Yeah, average quality.
Yeah.
But to the lender and to the underwriter,
They know what that means.
that's that standardized terminology.
Okay, and now then this UCDP What is that?
So UCDP, again, beginning in 2011, that's a data portal. So every appraisal that is written for the secondary market, so for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, gets submitted by the lender to UCDP. And think of it just as a big database, right?
Okay.
So, and they're using this database to evaluate the quality of appraisals. So they're looking for consistency amongst appraisals, okay, not only within the appraiser, but also for the entire market area. So Norm, all of the appraisals I submit, okay, in one town are submitted to UCDP. But all of my peers who also appraise in that same town are submitted to UCDP. Well, all of a sudden, it's not only the subject, it's the comparables. But if you have one appraiser that said this comparable sold for $150,000, and you've got another appraiser that said the same comparable, same date, sold for $180,000, well, that triggers UCDP that one of them is incorrect, and there's a problem, right? So it's building this database that is then available for the secondary market to be able to evaluate the quality of properties, the quality of appraisers, and the quality of appraisals, right, in an automated format.
Cool. All right, and we've already touched on this, and I don't know if you want to get into it any deeper, but the appraiser and the realtor relationship, and I think it's really important that we keep those lines of communications. But once again, the licensee, the real estate licensee, the agent, they have to be mindful, I think, that appraisers are people too, and there's different personalities for everybody. And I know that just like there is with realtors, there's different, and I'm sure you've dealt with that. And so I think it's just that whole thing. And I know that from a realtor board level, we've tried to work closely with the appraisers, including, okay, is there data that you need that we're not collecting or that we're not, building a data set on, we can't turn our entire MLS program over just for the appraisal process, but they are an integral part of it, and I think we need to understand that. And I think we've already touched on, okay, so the appraisal is bad, or it doesn't appraise. Yeah, it's short. They usually don't complain about ones that are overappraised. So I think we've already touched on that. So unless you got anything you want to add to it, I think there's the process. And the key is that in most situations, the lender is in the driver's seat.
In most situations on a purchase where, yes, there's a mortgage involved, the lender is definitely in the driver's seat.
Yeah.